So what if you wanted to get this hard-coded data out of your view models and model objects and so on? You wanted to get it out into some separate data files that would not even be loaded at runtime. So what I could do instead, I'm going to put the not symbol back in here so that now these customers will only be populated at runtime. And again, if I simply build and go back to the designer, now we can see our data is gone. Now I want to provide some sample data there. And there's a couple ways to go about this. There's one very simple and crude way, which is that you can go into your project and you can add a new resource dictionary, which really just gives you a flat XAML file. And we'll call this My Design Data. Once I'm in here, I can add in other namespaces, such as my ZaData namespace, and then I could change the root element to be some object from that namespace. Once I've done that, I could drop in here and just start setting properties on the customer. So I could set my ID equal to a GUID. I could set my first name equal to some value. Now I have a sample data object that I can actually use in the design time environment. So I'll save that and show you the direct way of using it. If I go into the XAML of my main window, I'm going to drop down to that text box I put at the bottom. I can add a data context to just this element using the DDataContext property that we saw before. And what I'm going to set it to is a DDesignData markup extension. This takes a source property, which can point to a XAML file. So I'll point it to My Design Data, and it's basically going to look into that XAML file, take the root element, create an instance of it, and use that as the data context. Then I could take the text here and just set up a binding to first name. And as soon as I do that, in the designer, we can see it's pulling Brian out of that design time data file. Now, setting up those data files by hand can be a little bit of work. Unfortunately, there's no direct support in Visual Studio for this, but if you just drop over to Blend for Visual Studio, I'm going to fire up Blend for Visual Studio 2012, and certainly it still works in 2013 as well. I'm just sticking to 2012 since 13 just came out. I can go and open this same project, and once we're in here, we can go to this Data tab over on the right, and we can select at a project level, and in the upper right corner, you can see Create Sample Data. We'll say New Sample Data, and you can also create sample data from a class. But I'm just going to show you the raw experience here. I'll say Create Sample Data, and we'll accept Sample Data Source. And what it starts out with here is it's got a root level collection, which we'll call customers, just like the customers property hanging off of our view model. And then it's got a couple of properties declared here. First off, a string. So we'll rename that one to be first name. This other one is set to a Boolean. We'll switch that to be a string as well. And you can see there's various options depending on the type that you select. And we'll call this ID. Now you can see there's not a one-to-one match here. Our ID is actually a GUID. A GUID is not an option for the sample data. But for getting the UI laid out and stuff, this can get you pretty close. Now, as soon as that's done, what I can do is go over here to my data grid, and I'm going to delete this data grid out of here that was already here. I'm going to go into the toolbox here, find a data grid, select my root grid here in the main window, and double click on the data grid. That's going to add a new instance of it. I'm going to go ahead and reset layout all. It's going to end up overlaying my text box, but we're not going to use that anymore anyway. Now that I have an empty data grid here, I can drag and drop the customers collection from my sample data source onto my data grid. And we can see it immediately populates with some sample data. Now I'm just going to save what I did and jump back over to Visual Studio. We'll reload all, and let's take a look at what it did for us. First off, you can see it added a sample data subfolder with the sample data source, and under that a XAML file with an XSD. The structure of that XAML file is kind of similar to what we were setting up by hand. It's got a single root object that has a customer's collection property, and then it's got individual customer items underneath that. Now you can see it called these customer item instead of customer. That shouldn't matter. Bindings actually don't couple to the type of the object that they're binding to, only to the property names on the containing objects. So as long as this matches up with our customer's property on our view model, and the properties we put on our customer items match up with the properties on a customer, we should be good to go for getting this all hooked up. Because we selected project level, it declared an instance of that sample data source as an object inside of our application scoped resource dictionary and gave it a key of sample data source. In the main window, you can see what it did is declared our data grid from our drag and drop operation, and it set the data context on that equal to that sample data source. Now it should have, and sometimes does, use the D data context here. You really only want that to be the data context on this data grid for design time data. For runtime, we want our data context to flow down from the window, especially if we're doing MVVM like this. So I can build and go back to the designer and just prove that our sample data is still there. But now, because our view model was populating our customer's collection if we are not in the designer, and because this data context is only going to overwrite what data context comes down the visual tree if we're in design time, it means that we can run this and we can see that our data coming from our view model is there at runtime, but in the designer, we've got our sample data there. So you can see these D namespace markup extensions and properties give you a lot of power and flexibility to declare things that will be there in the design time environment. These can help you in getting your UI laid out, visualizing what it's going to look like, handle things like localization, but then at runtime, that data can be replaced automatically with your real runtime data.